Thank you, Ash. I'd just like to start by thanking the previous speakers for their time and their energy tonight, as well as acknowledging the traditional inhabitants and custodians of this land. And for those that don't really have an immediate understanding of what the term psychedelic refers to, it simply means mind manifesting. People can have some weird references to that term I've found from pop culture or whatever they've seen, but it's essentially a way of framing our greater potential for awareness, the way I might put it. Now, I'd like to take you on a journey into acknowledging the different aspects of the human psyche, aspects that may be confronted as part of the human journey. I will focus on the inspiration that may be realized through the psychedelic enabling of peak experiences, new perspectives, and a re-empowerment of our awareness of our potential. This will commence with an historical introduction to our confrontation with the amplification of psychic content through the psychedelic experience and with otherwise hidden domains of the psyche. I'll also include various models that have attempted to map the psychic territory of the psychedelic experience, as well as summarizing some of the modern psychedelic research, especially as it relates to LSD. After that, I'm actually going to introduce a special panel of 3 guests, and we're going to have a discussion about themes relating to the psychedelic experience, its meaning, what we can draw from it, and how we can meaningfully integrate these experiences into our lives through our relationship with ideas, movement, technological possibilities, and with each other. Next slide. So I guess we're celebrating bicycle today. Albert Hoffman, I guess, first discovers, or synthesizes it, I should say, in about 1938. And 1943, he resynthesizes it and absorbs supposedly a small amount through his fingers. Goes home, the way Albert Hoffman does, usually on a bike. Noticed about 2 hours he was sort of tripping out a bit. He said, I lay down and sank into a not so unpleasant intoxicated-like condition characterized by an extremely stimulated imagination. Suffice to say, his curiosity was sparked. So, what does one do? So a few days later, he consciously ingests what we know as pretty much a double dose of LSD, double standard dose before cycling home, with his medical doctor's reassurance that his physical well-being is all good, which we can understand from a set and setting perspective as being very reassuring and very calming to the individual. He stated, I became more confident that the danger of insanity was conclusively past. Very reassuring, isn't it? He went on to write, little by little, I could begin to enjoy the unprecedented colours and plays of shape that persisted behind my closed eyes. Kaleidoscopic, fantastic images surged in on me, alternating, variegated, opening and then closing themselves in circles and spirals, exploding in coloured fountains, rearranging and hybridizing themselves in constant flux. Not your average day, really, is it, for someone in 1943? Next slide. So this is Albert Hoffman in his laboratory holding a, plastic molecule of LSD. And later on that day, next slide. This apparently must have happened. Next slide. So Sandoz Laboratories, who Albert Hoffman worked for, sent this interesting chemical around to a lot of research psychiatric settings in Europe and around the world. Some of the researchers described it as this. The effect of LSD was a transitory toxic state, disturbing the barrier of repression and permitting a re-examination of significant experiences of the past that was sometimes relived with a frightening realism. So when thinking about that sentence, that paragraph, you might think, well, why would someone want to experience that? Reliving with frightening realism significant experiences of the past that was... There can be some pretty dark things there, obviously. And so I guess we look at this original psychoanalyst when it comes to why people would want to confront some of these difficult and challenging experiences. Next slide. Jung said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Next slide. There's also another quote, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Next slide. So Jung, the historical reports about psychoanalyst Carl Jung looking at the effects of LSD are a little bit confusing when you read them. He was aware of mescaline and seemed to think a lot of mescaline, but he seemed to not be aware of how similar LSD was with mescaline. And I think he was quite cautious around some of the psychiatrists treating their patients with it, and just the ability, in contrast with his own sort of examination of the unconscious through dream state analysis and intuition. So, yeah, he did appear to sort of encouraging caution. Well, it's a general thing anyway, isn't it, for a lot of us? With regard to the use of LSD, he sounded quite conflicted about its merit for use in psychiatry, considering the power and his own sort of career and looking at examining these things in a sort of more slowed down manner, you might say. Next slide. But nonetheless, he left us with a very interesting and useful model to refer to when understanding the human psyche and the greater potential there. So you can see the personal unconscious, and he named this thing called the shadow. So these dark, sort of, not necessarily dark, but repressed or denied aspects of the self that lay in the personal unconscious. And those previous quotes obviously relate to confronting those aspects and the psychedelic experience that becomes a particularly interesting phenomena. Jung also, through his analysis of much of the world's culture, historically speaking as well, Eastern mysticism, all kinds of things, he conceived of the collective unconscious in which archetypal forms exist in as signifiers of meaning. And within the collective unconscious, there's other possibilities for the qualities that the psyche takes on. So a very interesting model that built upon Freud's ideas and extended them to sort of create a more flexible understanding of what's possible, really. Next slide. Some modern artists have sort of worked with this concept. This is Maynard James Keenan from the band Tall, who embodies different archetypes as he screams his vocals. In this case, see my shadow changing, stretching up and over me. Soften this old armor, hoping I can clear the way by stepping through the shadow. So he's sort of embodying the whole journey of confronting the shadow complex and moving towards the greater aspects of transpersonal awareness through this process. Next slide. So Stan Groff was sort of a graduate psychiatry student when LSD became a big thing, or was sort of emerging, and he, I guess, volunteered for a experiment involving LSD, in which he was the subject given LSD, and it's very interesting because part of the experiment involved him being, I think he's wearing an electroencephalogram cap on his head, so they were doing some recording there, but he was exposed to a stroboscopic light pulsating towards him during this experiment. So it was a very interesting setup. This is his, might call it a trip report. I couldn't believe how much I learned about my psyche in those few hours. I experienced a fantastic display of colourful visions, some abstract and geometrical, others figurative and filled with symbolic import. The sheer intensity of the array of emotions I felt simply amazed me. So then the stroboscopic light hits him. I was hit by a radiance that seemed comparable to the epicenter of a nuclear explosion, or perhaps the light of supernatural brilliance said to in Oriental scriptures to appear to us at the moment of death. This thunderbolt catapulted me out of my body. First, I lost awareness of my immediate surroundings, then the psychiatric clinic, then Prague, then finally the planet. At an inconceivable speed, my consciousness expanded to cosmic dimensions. I experienced the Big Bang, passed through black holes and white holes in the universe, identified with exploding supernovas, and witnessed many other strange phenomena that seemed like to be pulsars, quasars, and other cosmic events. Another typical day at the office. So this person was trained kind of in a classical biomedical model influenced by Freudian analysis. And then he has this subjective experience under these experimental conditions, and I guess became very clear to him that he was able to see the irony and paradox of the situation. As he wrote, the divine manifested itself and took him over in a modern scientific laboratory in the middle of a scientific experiment conducted in a communist country with a substance produced in the test tube of a 20th century chemist. So this whole new paradigm became thrust upon this person, and it changed his whole career, and he became one of the most experienced psychedelic researchers in 20th century history as a result, administering over 4,000 doses and coming up with his own model of what's actually going on. There's a couple of his books at the bookstore for APS here if you're interested in checking it out further. Next slide. I won't get into this too much, but he created a model for understanding these experiences as he sort of witnessed them through this research he was involved in. He likened psychedelic experiences as a state of deep unconscious and super-conscious levels of the human psyche being experienced. This included the sensory barrier that could be enhanced attention to perceptual stimuli and symbology, and the recollective biographical barrier. So that could include unresolved emotional issues, autobiographical experiences or perspectives. And there's this regression-like tendency that he's observed and written about, and he's basically described the way people seem to be re-experiencing the birthing process. And he's got four sequences for that. That form the perinatal matrices, and what that might look like from a third-person perspective is sort of signs of struggle or periodic suffocation or infantile kind of body language, kind of like someone looking like they're a baby trying to almost be birthed, as they embody that kind of a perinatal kind of traumatic experience. So quite complex stuff, but this is what he's observed and written about. And beyond that, the transpersonal dimensions of the psyche, subjective merging with one's environment at large, a loss of a sense of personal self or ego, self-transcendence. But one of the keys to this being of therapeutic significance for Groff was the idea that, and this is a recent quote from him, these states identify problems and mobilize inner healing intelligence that reveals unconscious content in the best order. That's another way of saying, I guess, that if there's a conflict or tension, you're going to be confronted by it, and if you're able to move through that process, then you can emerge in a therapeutically more advanced state, one might say. Next slide. So we said each of us can manifest the properties of a field of consciousness that transcends space, time, and linear causality, referring to these transpersonal realms that he articulates in his books. Next slide. Alan Watts said, LSD is simply an exploratory instrument like a microscope or telescope, except this one is inside of you instead of outside of you. So the analogy of a tool becomes sort of evident here with quotes like this. Next slide. So Tim Leary was a Harvard personality psychologist and clinical psychologist who he had psilocybin in Mexico and was very impressed by it. But he was quite reluctant to try LSD in the early 60s until an English friend, Michael Hollingshead, gave him his paste, which he was handing around to a bunch of artists at the time who were all buddies. And this had a major impact on Larry. He's known as quite a countercultural figurehead of the 60s and whatnot, and known for quite some radical behaviour. I think Richard Nixon called him the most dangerous man in the world at one point. He didn't murder anyone, he just had unusual ideas, and this is his first trip report of acid. It's been 5 years since that first LSD trip. I've never forgotten it, nor has it been possible for me to return to the life I had been leading before the session. I've never recovered from the shattering ontological confrontation. I've never been able to take myself, my mind, and the social world around me seriously. Since that time 5 years ago, I've been acutely aware of the fact that I perceive everything within and around me as a creation of my own consciousness. I've taken some of the bits and pieces that were pretty radical out of this. Since that first trip with Michael, I was never able to commit myself to the game of proselytizing for LSD itself. Nothing doesn't ring true to my ancient cell wisdom and to that of into that central vibrating beam within can hold my attention for very long. So quite a extreme reaction in a way, and that can be seen in some of his promotion and behavior afterwards as he left Harvard with Richard Alpert and Rolf Metzer as well, I believe, and promoted kind of widespread use of it. Keep in mind that him and his friends were all sort of academics, graduate students, and were able to sort of be stable and well integrate their experiences, and he kind of underestimated just the way in which this chemical and psychedelics in general thrust upon the general public might bring up these shadow issues that people just can't manage, especially without set and setting being really reinforced as part of harm reduction. So they were a bit naive in a way because of their limited exposure, and things transpired as they did. Next slide. Along with Richard Alpert and Ralph Metzner, who recently passed, Dr. Ralph Metzner, who's had some great books. They basically reframed the Tibetan Book of the Dead, but based on the experience of the psychedelic experience, sort of making the two things analogous. And in this book, written in the 60s, the three of them, they write, a psychedelic experience is a journey to new realms of consciousness. The scope and content of the experience is limitless, but its characteristic features are the transcendence of verbal concepts, of space-time dimensions, and of the ego or identity. Such experiences of enlarged consciousness can occur in a variety of ways, including sensory deprivation, yoga exercises, disciplined meditation, religious or aesthetic ecstasies, or spontaneously. Most recently, they have become available to anyone through the ingestion of psychedelic drugs such as LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, DMT, etc. This is an important finish to this, and I think Parash mentioned this earlier. Of course, the drug does not produce the transcendent experience. It merely acts as a chemical key. It opens the mind, frees the nervous system of its ordinary patterns and structures, and the modern neuroscience would very much expand on that through neuroimaging and whatnot. Next slide. So Larry eventually became quite a bit more wise, I should say, about what this experience is, and this is actually going to double as my disclaimer. So eventually he started to emphasize the essential importance of the psychological set of the individual and the physical setting or environment variables along with the dose as three incredibly important variables influencing the actual experience someone has and what that becomes basically. And Larry eventually wrote, acid is not for every brain. Only the healthy, happy, wholesome, handsome, hopeful, humorous, high velocity should seek these experiences. This elitism is totally self-determined. Unless you are self-confident, self-directed, self-selected, please abstain. That's a bit of a turnaround from turn on, tune in, drop out. So, yeah, he eventually becomes quite wise and emphasizes caution in a way that would be a bit more socially responsible, we might say. Next slide. Alan Watts was an interesting kind of religious scholar who had this experience himself with LSD, DMT, cannabis, mescaline. And he had this idea that you get a message. So these are two different schools of thought. I've got Dennis McKenna here as well, who came after Alan Watts. Watts said if you get the message, hang up the phone. For psychedelic drugs are simply instruments like microscopes, telescopes, and telephones. The biologist does not sit with their eye permanently glued to the microscope. He goes away and works on what he has seen, he or she. Dennis McKenna said more recently, the message changes every time. So these are different perspectives, different schools of thought almost, and every individual can assimilate them into their own sort of journey, I guess, and whatever context they include there. Next slide. Larry, his sociobiology of consciousness is built on his personality psychology to include psychedelic modalities, was further articulated by Robert Anton Wilson, who was kind of friends with all those kind of people, and sort of a polymath. He read into everything, studied the occult, mysticism, everything, semantics, engineering, you name it. Robert Anton Wilson wrote a book called Prometheus Rising, and he expanded on Leary's theory and put a bunch of stuff in there. But basically the idea is it's an evolutionary hypothesis started by Leary and further elaborated by Robert Anton Wilson that postulates 4 terrestrial survival circuits: biosurvival, emotional, territorial, conceptual, semantic, and sociosexual. So these are modalities of human development in normal psychology and as measured by sort of normal personality measures. With psychedelics as the catalyst or stimulus, there are 4 identified higher order, not necessarily higher order, but higher modalities or greater entropy states, perhaps you might understand in light of the modern research. Circuit 5, or the first psychedelic modality, was identified as the holistic neurosomatic circuit. You might say that most people want to experience this one because all incoming stimuli with this hypothesis are interpreted through this filter of subjective bliss. So all information, interoceptive information, is interpreted through this filter of subjective bliss, right? Very orgasmic, like turn on, as they call it. But this can go in the opposite direction with this hypothesis as well, and all incoming sensory data can also be interpreted through the filter of the subjective dissonance or schizophrenic-like mind state, or the dissonance leading to medical conditions, all kinds of things. And he cites yogic practitioners who flick this switch in the wrong direction in the neural circuitry and experience all these health-related physical symptoms and write books about how crap life is, pretty much. And then they flick it in the right direction, then all of a sudden life's this just state of presence and bliss and all that kind of a thing. So that explains that particular modality. Beyond that, there's the metaprogramming circuitry or modality, and involves the reconditioning of symbol associations. Space-time and paradigmatic fluidity become a subjective experience. Then there's the neurogenetic circuit, which can involve the manifestation of biogenetic information and archetypes, like from Jungian's collective unconscious model. So there's an information contained through this hypothesis in DNA, which is access. And that's more of a collective unconscious sensibility as well. Beyond that, there's the quantum non-local circuit. So that's complete ego dissolution and union with all space-time events. So that's like DMT, high-dose ketamine. Just there's no sense of identity. There's no structure holding consciousness. It's just almost like a void. And this was kind of, they redeveloped this to kind of be fitting with the Eastern chakra system model as well, roughly. That's why this picture is made as such. And these extraterrestrial circuits are supposed to be, through this hypothesis, part of our space migration, our migration into space, and how consciousness changes as the biological system adapts to the weightless space environment. Next slide. So for the past 2,500 years, philosophers have been developing different ways of understanding consciousness, mindedness, all these kind of things. And with psychedelics, these ideas take on a particular meaning. New ontological paradigms are often intimated during moments of relational meaning awareness, as we embody a moment of novel pause and reflection between stimulus and response. It's the kind of sentence I come up with when I'm in a certain state of consciousness. Some themes from Eastern philosophy that describe consciousness and subjectivity as inherently primary become quite significant for people in psychedelic states. Panpsychism is the doctrine that everything material, however small, has an element of individual consciousness. Information structure provides the fabric for conscious experience and self-organizing systems. So consciousness isn't limited to what's generated by the brain. It can embody different biological structures and structures in general. Idealism is the metaphysical view that associates reality to ideas in the mind rather than to material objects. It lays emphasis on the mental components of experience, consciousness as a primary substrate, and renounces the notion of material existence as having a causal role in creating consciousness. So the brain wouldn't be the creator of consciousness. The brain is a structure that exists within the flow of consciousness as experienced from a localized space-time perspective, namely us examining it. And as Alfred Korzybski said in General Semantics, the map is not the territory, which kind of is somewhat analogous to the philosophy of mind, academic Chalmers' hard problem of consciousness, that we can't just explain away the fact that subjectivity is different from the way we see things, and just the brain as an organ. Transmission theory of consciousness looks at consciousness and the brain through a sort of a TV or radio analogy. So you change the channel, you change the reality, which is what psychedelics might be seen to do, whereas taking a stimulant or depressant drug might involve altering the contrast brightness. Psychedelics would be like changing the channel or the bandwidth frequency range. Next slide. It's important that we reflect on art and what artists have been compelled to create when it comes to looking at different philosophies and ways of interpreting our experiences with psychedelics. This one in particular, I think, there's a body structure to it, but at the same time, there's simultaneity of scale, and there's also this void of everything connected almost at some point there as well. So it kind of embodies how logically impossible the subjective experience can be at a certain dose effect of a psychedelic. And what ideas come from that are what have often manifested in culture throughout history through yogic traditions and whatnot. Next slide. Dennis McKenna said, I get frustrated with people who say that a drug experience can have no spiritual validity. I'm here to tell you that all experience is a drug experience. We're all on drugs all the time, largely because we're made of drugs. So our brains run on the electrodynamics of neurotransmitter action, docking, making changes in the cellular networks and whatnot. So if it's not exogenous from without, it's happening within, and it's all chemically mediated process, as you'd say. Next slide. So a lot of what our brain does is synthesize a hallucination, a model of the world that we proceed to live in. This is a model reality. The real reality is completely unknowable. So it puts into perspective how very uniquely individualized and different our own subjective experiences can be, and also the way different cultures can look at the world in a very different way. So I guess let's look at what the modern research has sort of made of the changes to the brain on psychedelics. Next slide. The image on the left is resting state communication between node or networks of the brain. The image on the right is a brain on psilocybin. There's a few more things there. So resting state connectivity, you can see, is greatly enhanced, and you can look at this as kind of like the reducing of a valve or the loosening of a bottleneck, and all of a sudden there's this free flow into a greater state of entropy. So there's a lack of constriction into orderliness, concerted orderliness, and there's exposure to a lot more communication and information as such. Next slide. And what we observe also when we look at the effect in test tubes and animal studies is that it actually provides the stimulus for increasing the structural and functional neuroplasticity of the cellular networks in the brain. So you can see the control, which is the method of administration without any drug, and the top line there, there's no branching or anything. But as you apply DOA as a substitute amphetamine with psychedelic properties, DMT and LSD, you can see there's all this branching phenomena going on here. Neurogenesis, synaptogenesis, spinogenesis. So it's the reverse of pruning, which happens as you develop in the brain, where the sort of the connections that are less relevant to your survival and functioning and more disordered become pruned away. This actually gives the possibility of new connections and new ways of framing our whole world, pretty much, to the degree to which we work on that in a constructive way. Next slide. So what happens in terms of psychedelics in the brain, structurally and functionally? Well, there's a default mode network, the sort of autobiographical chatter of normal modality functioning when we're not focused on a specific task. So what we see for the neuroimaging is decreased activity in this network. The psychedelic stimulus promotes unconstrained cognition, enhances possible flow states, reduces the ego boundedness of cognition, increases a sense of connectivity or even boundlessness. As previously rigid patterns change, new possibilities of information and communication come as your ego dissolves and this network is sort of disrupted, and your sense of self with it, in a sense. Next slide. And as Prash mentioned earlier, the entropic brain theory, Robert Carhart Harris sort of looked at this when it comes to explaining mental states under psychedelics, and just the idea that the brain looks to create an orderly state with reduced entropy, and with psychedelic stimulus applied, it sends you further to the left of this curve, in which there's a lot more disorder. And a lot less of the orderliness that is necessary for survival and energy conservation in the brain. Next slide. So modern research summary. The brain is designed to constrain perception and conserve free energy to promote survival, reduce the disorder. Psychedelics open up this reducing valve on our perception, increasing resting state functional connectivity, which is that rubber band-like diagram, increasing structural and functional plasticity, these neural networks, the growth possibilities, deactivates the default mode network, reduces our self-thought, such as future planning, reduces ego boundedness, increases connectivity with the world. Next slide. So Peter Sosjid, I'm not very good at pronouncing that word, who is, recently, he's a philosopher, by the way, of psychedelic consciousness and philosophy. He recently did a TED talk, and he quotes A.R. Orage, 1906. This dates back to new modes of consciousness will be needed, as the mystics have always declared. The differencing element of man and Superman will be the possession of these. So if we look down 20th century history, next slide, we will see that LSD has been integrated into different people's lives in different ways, and many scientists have actually been positively affected by their experiences and integrated them in terms of the creative impetus in their work and the way they have cognized the problems and the solutions to the problems in their professional and scientific work. So 2 Nobel Prize winning scientists have been fond of psychedelics like LSD. This is Francis Crick, who co-created the double helix structure of DNA. Next slide. And Kary Mullis is the winner of the 1993 Nobel Prize in Chemistry for his discovery of polymerase chain reaction, multiplying segments of DNA in a test tube, for instance. And he seemed to be quite a keen user to some degree of psychedelics, and in a documentary actually said, what if I'd never taken LSD ever? Would I have still invented PCR? I don't know, I doubt it. Next slide. So looking at the potential that these as tools and catalysts provide us when it comes to awakening our sense of what's possible and moving through our shadow issues, reorganizing our experience of the world in more constructive ways, and being empowered through that process. Robert Anton Wilson in particular was an advocate for our capacity for meta-programming, that is reprogramming our experience of the world, and just being aware of our ability to do that as we consciously walk around and become more aware of the way our brain interacts with the world, the way our mind functions, and what the possibilities are for reframing every moment, really. And he was also a scholar of occult history and whatnot, and mysticism. He wrote, "We look for the secret, the philosopher's stone, the elixir of the wise, supreme enlightenment, God or whatever, and all the time it is carrying us about. It is the human nervous system itself." Next slide. Gerald Hurd, a sort of religious scholar, found LSD to be very interesting. There's a quote from a video you can all see on YouTube, in which he describes the way in which LSD compels people into a new perspective. And one of my favorite quotes ever of psychedelics is this: the sober certainty of waking bliss. Those words just resonate throughout my head all the time, so I can never read that sentence enough. Next slide. And with this new, fresh way of looking at the world, as Maynard said, we can recognize this experience of being human as a whole kind of holy gift in a way, and celebrate this chance in every moment, our creative potential, to celebrate this moment to be alive and breathing. Next slide. Similarly, visionary artist Alex Gray said, be an artist of consciousness. Your picture of reality is your most important creation. Make it powerfully, profoundly beautiful. Again, this meta programming potential we have to create something that's unique and empowering to ourselves and others potentially. And with that, he went on to create art like the next slide, which is part of one of his books that was appeared on the cover of DMT, the Spirit Molecule, Dr. Rick Strassman's book. So that's the end of this presentation. But we've got more in for you tonight. In fact, it only gets better. We're going to take a... We're going to take a short break, and we're going to set up a bit of an animation. So take a deep breath, take care of yourselves, and then I'm going to introduce 3 special panelists, and we're going to have an interesting conversation. So yeah, take care of yourselves, and we'll meet you back here very soon.